Hello, cats and kitties. It's Terry Lee here, and I'm trying to squeeze in a true crime before I go to the dentist to get my teeth extracted. Woohoo! Today we are going to be talking about a guy by the name of Graham Young, also known as the teacup poisoner. This is a picture of him right here. Yeah, I know. He looks just fantastic, doesn't he? It's the kind of person you get in a car with, isn't he? My sister, or not my sister, excuse me, my daughter and I say that he kind of looks like a vampire, or he looks like an actor that needs to be auditioning for the part of a vampire. Anyway, this is Graham Young. This picture was taken when he was, I think, about 23, because he doesn't spend a lot of time not in a facility of some sort of incarceration between the ages of 14 and 23. Graham Young, and I'm going to be reading a lot from my notes this time around, so I apologize for that, but I'm going to be putting commentary in. Graham Young began poisoning his family at age 14 because apparently he was an overachiever. He went to a hospital for criminals with mental problems and then was released after 9 years. He then went on another poisoning spree that turned deadly. So let's learn a little bit about Graham. Graham Frederick Young was born in Neasden, Middlesex in northern London on September the 7th, 1947 to Fred and Bessie Young. Now, tragically, when Young was 3 months old, Bessie would die of tuberculosis. And that was actually fairly common back then, sadly enough. And Fred was overcome by Bessie's death. He just couldn't deal. He had a new baby. So he sent Graham, the 3-month-old, to live with his Aunt Winnie and Uncle Jack. Young's older sister, Winifred, went to live with her grandparents. Now, Young lived the first 2 years of his life with his aunt and uncle, so that was all he knew for the first 2 years of his life. I don't know if he was visited by his father in that time and his sister. I have no idea. But he, suffice to say, was used to being with his aunt and uncle. Young's father married a woman named Molly, and he brought his children back to home to reunite the family, and they moved to St. Albans. Now, Graham suffered serious separation anxiety after being taken away from his aunt and uncle, and he developed into a child that was largely solitary and had no real interest in getting to know kids his own age. So this separation from Aunt Winnie and Uncle Jack really did have an effect on him. Young's childhood interests were different. He enjoyed reading books about murderers, including the famous poisoners Dr. Crippen and William Palmer. He read extensively about Nazi Germany and was fascinated by Adolf Hitler. He would wear swastikas, and he would talk to anybody who would be willing to listen to him as he extolled the virtues of Hitler. He said Hitler was misunderstood. He also read about the occult, and one of my sources said that he tried to get local kids to join in on the sacrifice of a cat. I only saw that in one source, so I don't know how true that is. His main academic interests were chemistry, forensics, and especially toxicology. These topics, other than chemistry, were not covered in depth at school as much as he preferred, so he did quite a bit of extracurricular reading about toxology. His father wanted to encourage his academic pursuits, so he bought him a chemistry set. Great idea. And Young was obsessed with it. And by age 13, Young was so knowledgeable about poisons and toxicology that he was able to convince a local chemist, or what we would call a pharmacist, a local chemist, that he was 17 years old and he was able to obtain antimony, digitalis, arsenic, and the heavy metal thallium for his studies. Yeah. So he was able to get seriously poisonous stuff from a chemist at the age of 13. So that's going to go well, we can tell right now. Young wanted to test his knowledge of poison, so he decided to experiment on his young fellow science student, Christopher Williams. So he's going to try this on a classmate. Williams began to suffer from cramps, vomiting, and headaches. And Christopher Williams' doctors, they were baffled at what was wrong with him, but he did survive. He lived. And Young was annoyed that he couldn't monitor Christopher's reactions while Christopher was home from school sick. He did not know what was happening at that time, and he couldn't record that in his diary. Yes, he kept a diary of his poisonings and the effects of the poisonings. So Young decided that he would move on to test subjects that he could watch all the time, and that would be his family. So, yeah, when Young was 14, his family began to show signs of being poisoned: cramps, vomiting, nausea. Young's father thought it was because Young wasn't being careful with his chemistry set, and he told Young, quote, "Be careful when messing about with those bloody chemicals," unquote. Okay, Young was also ill during this time, so it led people to wonder later on if he wasn't poisoning himself a little bit to avoid suspicion. I'm not too sure about that, but he was ill at the same time as his family. In November of 1961, Young's elder sister, Winifred, collapsed on a train on the way to work. She was taken to the hospital and found to have somehow been exposed to belladonna. She survived. Meanwhile, Young was beginning to concentrate his efforts on his stepmother, Molly. She was gradually becoming sicker and sicker, and she was finally taken to the hospital on April 21st, 1962, which was Easter Sunday. She died later that evening. The death certificate listed her death as due to a prolapsed cervical disc from an earlier car accident. Much later, Young would admit to poisoning her with antimony, but she developed a tolerance to it, so he then poisoned her with thallium, which killed her. He even poisoned people at her wake, and for those of you not familiar with the term wake, that is the gathering of family and friends after a funeral when a person dies. And so it's meant to be a time when you talk about the person, when you talk about memories and share good memories of that person. Yeah, poison people at the wake. So there you go. After Molly's death, Fred's attacks of cramping and vomiting became worse and more frequent. He was admitted to the hospital and found to have antimony poisoning. He couldn't accept the fact that it was his own son that had done this, but in fact it was a teacher who began to become suspicious of Young. Young's knowledge of toxicology was just kind of frightening to him, and so he did a search and he found poisons and materials about poisoners in Young's desk. Young was sent to a police psychiatrist who was posing as a career counselor. The psychiatrist was amazed at Young's knowledge of poisons and toxicology, and he contacted the police. Vials of thallium and antimony were found on Young's person, and he was arrested on May 25th, 1962. So he was 14. No murder charges were brought against him for Molly because Molly had been cremated, but he confessed to poisoning his father, sister, stepmother, and Christopher Williams. But again, no murder charges for Molly because she was cremated. Psychiatrist Dr. Christopher Fish said that Young had a psychiatric disorder and had failed to, quote, develop a normal moral sense, quote, and was, quote, extremely likely to reoffend, quote. He quoted Young as saying, "I'm missing my antimony. I miss the power it gives me." In the end, Young was convicted at age 14 of poisoning his father, sister, and Christopher Williams. He was committed to Broadmoor Hospital for mentally ill criminals. So he was put in with some pretty bad dudes at the age of 14. He was sentenced to 15 years with no early release without the approval of Home Security. He was one of Broadmoor's youngest patients that they'd ever had. I think I remember reading that he was their youngest patient since 1885. While Young was at Broadmoor, an inmate died of cyanide poisoning. And Young had bragged that he knew how to make cyanide from laurel plants, and he confessed to the poisoning, but no one took him seriously. The inmate's death was ruled a suicide. Also, a tea urn was found to have an abrasive sodium inside of it that would have caused a mass poisoning had it not been discovered before tea was served. And no one could prove it was Young, but many people thought it was Young. On February the 4th, 1971, Young, age 23, was released from Broadmoor, even though he once told a psychiatric nurse that once he got out, he was going to kill one person for every year that he had been in Broadmoor. That would be 9 years at the time of his release. So, there you go. After his release, he went to live in a hostel near his sister in Hemel Hempstead, England. His sister had remained in contact with him, although his father would have nothing to do with him. Young made trips to London to stock up on antimony, thallium, and other poisons by once again fooling chemists. One chemist said he wouldn't give him the poisons without a prescription, so Young went and wrote a prescription on a university head letter and brought it back and got the poisons. So, yeah. Not surprising, his friend at the hostel became sick, but he survived. Young eventually found work at a store at John Hadland Laboratories. It's a photographic supply firm in Bovingdon, Hertfordshire. His new employee knew about his stay in Broadmoor, but not about why. He didn't know about the poisonings. So one of Young's duties was to make tea and coffee for his colleagues. I think we all know where this is going. Unsurprisingly, people began to get sick. The employees called it the Bovington bug because they thought that they had a virus. Young's boss, 59-year-old Bob Eagle, got very sick. He got better when he took sick leave at home, but got even sicker when he came back to work. He became so sick that he was admitted to the hospital, and he died there July 7th, 1971. In September of 1971, so Young does not wait a long time here, Fred Biggs, 60, developed the same symptoms as Bob Eagle had, and Biggs was admitted to the hospital and eventually died on November 19th, 1971. So this is just a few months later after Bob died. Biggs had taken a long time to die, and Young recorded his frustration about that in his diary. So apparently he just did not die quickly enough. By now, over 70 people were sick at the lab. The lab was having serious absentee problems. The on-site doctor tried to reassure the employees, but Young began arguing with the doctor about how thallium poisoning could be possible, because thallium was used in the process at the laboratory. The doctor was amazed at Young's knowledge of toxicology, and he reported it to management, and management reported it to the police. When they investigated the hostel, they found Young's poisons and his diaries that contained dosages and reactions of people that he had poisoned. And he would name these people by letter. So, for example, Bob would be B, Fred would be F. So they could tell who he had poisoned by which letter he was referring to. He was arrested in Sheerness, Kent, on November the 21st, 1971. He confessed verbally, but he refused to sign a written statement. He pleaded not guilty, but advancements in forensics and his horrible diary entries worked against him. He was found guilty of 2 cases of first-degree murder and 2 cases of poisonings. He was sentenced to life on January the 29th, 1972. When asked about whether he felt any remorse or not, he said, "What I feel is the emptiness of my soul." Wow. And you can kind of see that in the picture I showed you of him in the beginning. He does look kind of like there's not a lot going on there with feeling and emotion and empathy. He was incarcerated at Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight, where some of Britain's most dangerous criminals are incarcerated. So he went to the big house, literally. While at Parkhurst, Young befriended Ian Brady, one of the Moore murderers. Now, if you know who Ian Brady is, you know that he is an infamous killer. And they bonded over playing chess in Nazi Germany. There you go. And Young even sported a Hitler mustache often when he was at Parkhurst. Graham Young died in his cell at 42 on August the 1st, 1990. The cause was listed as heart failure, but there have been questions about whether he was poisoned or even poisoned himself just to get out of the situation. So that is the tale of Graham Young, but there is an aftermath. One of the things that happened because of Graham Young and because of his crimes is the 1972 Poisons Act was was created in England, and that was basically an act that made it much harder to get toxic materials for your basic layman. And people were really concerned and amazed how easily Graham got his toxic chemicals from a chemist. The next thing that was an aftermath of Graham Young's case was the Butler Committee. And the Butler Committee was created so that the release and care of mentally ill people was looked at a little bit more closely, because clearly the ball was dropped in letting Graham Young out. So the Butler Committee wanted to look at reform for both the care of mentally ill people and the release and the watching over of mentally ill people. In 1995, a film was made about Graham's life, and it was called The Young Poisoner's Handbook. It was a dark comedy, but loosely followed the events of his life. In November of 2005, a 16-year-old Japanese schoolgirl poisoned her mom with thallium after seeing the movie, The Young Poisoner's Handbook. She kept her results on a blog, just like Young did on his diary. So, yeah, here we are, how many years later? 15 years later after his death, and we've still got people looking at what he was doing and trying to emulate him the way that Young wanted to emulate the poisoners that he studied. So that's Graham Young, the teacup poisoner, who apparently poisoned everybody he ever saw. And it sounds to me like, obviously there's a mental problem going on there, but it was almost like a compulsion. It was almost like he couldn't stop it. He had to poison people, and he had to record the effects of that. Now, I'm not saying that as an excuse, clearly no. But, you know, my daughter said, think of what he could have done if he had used his powers for good, so to speak. He was obviously a very competent chemist. He could have gone ahead and gotten a degree in chemistry. He could have had a career as a chemist, either in a pharmacy or in a lab, you know, but thankfully he was caught, and, you know, I don't think he would have ever stopped. According to the psychiatrist at the police station, he would absolutely reoffend, and he did, so we know that that's true. But this was a quick one. I wanted to squeeze this one in before I had my teeth extracted and before I got my upper plate, at which point I will have trouble talking. I seem to have trouble talking today. Sorry about that. But I wanted to get this one in really quickly. I hope that you enjoyed hearing about the teacup poisoner and that you found it interesting. You can look him up and find even more about him if you want to. But until next time, I hope that you guys are safe and you're taking care of each other, and I will see you probably not for a while. I've got to learn to talk again with my new upper plate, but I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.